So as mentioned, I am currently a senior scientist at Security Risk Advisors, which is actually a new job for me, and I'm very excited about that. So I do a lot of research and innovation and focus on cloud security, engineering, and architecture. Before that, I was an O365 sysadmin, so that's kind of my area of expertise, a little bit more so than many other things. And I'm also a grad student in computer science, so basically I'm just a masochist and have no free time, as well as being a Blue Team Village organizer. So here at DEF CON, you'll probably see me around quite a lot if you stop into Blue Team Village, to our Discord or wherever else. Um, and so I'm going to just hop right into it. So the title of this talk is Exploiting the O365 Duo Two-Factor um, Loophole or Misconfiguration. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the scope of this actually is. This applies to Office 365 on Azure's or on an Azure tenant, on which all basic authentication is not fully blocked, and we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. And this is happening on tenants where two-factor authentication or two-factor verification with Duo is implemented. And it applies to configurations most likely implemented prior to August 2020 or thereabouts, which I will get into. So for a quick background, in order to understand kind of what's going on here, there are a couple O365 authentication types. So Microsoft, being Microsoft, uses its own terminology. So what it refers to as legacy auth is basic authentication, and these are protocols that send username, password in header in plain text, essentially, unless they're sent via HTTPS or some other protocol. Modern authentication refers to a slightly different methodology with client-server authentication, uses access and refresh tokens, and importantly, modern authentication is a requirement in order for two-factor verification or any other MFA service to actually work. So that's a very important point. And then we also have some email protocols that may be familiar to people. POP, IMAP, SMTP are all legacy authentication protocols, although there is support for modern being built into them. The second one, Activesync, is going to be the most important one here. And then there are other ones like MAPI, RPC, and these are used for services like Microsoft Outlook. So what is this misconfiguration? So the first thing I want to clarify, Duo is not actually part of the misconfiguration. This is entirely on the Office 365 side of the equation. Duo's documentation explicitly notes that modern authentication is required in order for this Duo to be triggered. So that is a very important point here that they actually do make clear. The second part of this is conditional access policies in Azure Active Directory. So O365 as a tenant it's essentially backed by Azure Active Directory, and all access is run through Active Directory. And the configuration that Duo requires in order to work with O365 actually involves conditional access policy and what's called a custom control that basically enforces an action, i.e., triggering Duo authentication to a selected set of users, cloud apps or actions, and conditions if configured. And then finally, you can write a policy to either perform an action or deny access, period. And this access grant is where the Duo integration actually happens and what sends it off to Duo to go through that second factor. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So essentially, when you're configuring a conditional access policy, you have all of those previously listed assignments and access under the configuration in Azure Active Directory in the security portion under conditional access. So importantly, when you have conditions, you have options to kind of scope an action, a grant or deny, by something that you select. One of those things being client apps. So this was in preview before August 2020, which is kind of why this misconfiguration has happened probably as widely as it has. So you'll notice that, first of all, so this year right here is actually the current one. And I'll show you a little bit what the previous one looks like and why that would be an issue. But you'll notice that Activesync is listed separately. And in the new configuration, it's listed as Legacy Authentication Client. So there are some Exchange Activesync clients that are actually integrated with modern authentication, but that is not necessarily not necessarily the case, and it doesn't really indicate that it's always going to be under modern auth if it has a basic authentication workflow. So if not checked in this, as in this example, this duo policy, which operates under the condition of whatever user you select, conditions, client apps, all these three, or just the top two, which would be make sense to most people, it essentially means that Activesync would not be triggered to be pushed out to Duo. And then another previous configuration that people have used is actually creating a second conditional access policy that explicitly blocks legacy authentication clients. However, in the previous configuration, the only one that this actually applied to would be other clients, the way it actually appeared, because those are the commonly listed ones like POP and IMAP. So Activesync is kind of this weird protocol that's hanging out separately and is a bit misunderstood when someone like a systems administrator who may not be as familiar with it is configuring this policy. So if we leave out Activesync, what does this look like? So if you go into iOS mail, the regular mail application, not Outlook for iOS, and you go and you hit Microsoft Exchange account, you sign in. If you sign in with a company account, you'll get a pop-up from Microsoft. You enter your password. This window will trigger the Duo prompt to actually happen. So it's essentially this is reaching out, even if Activesync is not actually triggered. So there is basically iOS has support for supporting modern authentication and triggering that Duo prompt right in its own application. So after signing, the Duo prompt would show up. Cool. Enter your password, and Bob's your uncle, or whatever that weird expression is. That's the normal workflow. That's how people, normal users, would actually expect to be able to configure mail on the Apple iOS application. However, if you actually cancel out of that previous window or configure manually, you can actually configure the Activesync basic authentication side of the equation and wind up skipping the prompt entirely. And that is literally how this exploit actually works. It's essentially fail out of the Duo two-factor prompt or skip it, configure manually for Activesync. And because we have that hole where conditional access policy was not actually applied to that conditional access policy, then this is what we wind up with, the ability to do this. And honestly, this is something that when researching, you kind of go through this from this perspective of an end user who is just going to be able to, all they want to do is sign up for their email, and they're not going to notice whether or not they're, being prompted for Duo or not. In fact, they'll probably be happy not to be prompted for it. But that is essentially how to do it on iOS, and it still works. I've actually tested it this week. So, and this is also important to note because Activesync as a protocol is something that you can build right into an application, or run a script and password spray on an EC2 instance in AWS if you want to. Basic authentication literally is just a base64 encoded header addition that states what the authorization is. It's basic, includes a username and password. That's it. Pretty easy. In addition to that, Activesync gives clients access to email, contacts, calendars, and other things, not just email, but it also has no ability to enforce authorization aside from that initial authentication. So it essentially grants access to everything, which is why it can be such a lucrative exploit if you would like it to be, or why you should be a little nervous if you don't want it to be. So why does this happen? Prior to August 2020, on the left side, this image shows that Activesync was actually not listed or explicitly mentioned as being a legacy authentication protocol. So when customers have configured things like this second policy is mentioning to actually block basic authentication, they may have gone right to that other client's, noticed that had POP IMAP, and thought that that's all that was needed to block, and that's not necessarily the case. The updated version of configuration makes it a lot more clear, fortunately. The other thing is that client apps was in preview before August 2020, and previously it actually stated that conditional access policies by default apply to browser-based applications and applications that utilize modern authentication protocols, which meant it only applied when it was able to apply and did not impose any kind of automatic block or implicit deny behavior. In 2020, that actually changed. So when you apply a policy, even if it's, if you select Activesync and it does not, and your client is using basic authentication, it at least sees that it's supposed to be enforcing with modern authentication and prompting, and it actually fails out. That behavior is newer. And then the behavior of the client apps condition as well was updated in 2020. So previously, it wouldn't implicitly block anything or apply to all those four options on the right hand side. And as of after 2020, it actually checks all of them by default. So if a configuration was done after August 2020 with similar steps, everything would be checked off by default, and this hole would not exist because of that. So I know I'm really probably pretty short on time at this point. So just a quick note for actually finding this in a client. If you're Office 365 administrator and have access to the Azure Active Directory blade in Azure, if you actually search for Client App Exchange Activesync, you'll actually see it. And that is only going to show you the basic authentication side of Activesync clients. It fully re-authenticates, so you'll actually see frequent authentication actions, which is actually pretty cool. Just a quick note on this, though.
You have a few minutes.
Thank you. So note about this, I just dropped a quick little Splunk query in here. This should catch most of everything and give you kind of a breakdown of who's using it. But the sign-in logs are actually more accurate when they're accessed through the, I think the, keep wanting to say UAC, Unified Activity Log, that's it. Unified audit logs in PowerShell, and also in logs as they're configured and propagated to Splunk, rather than in the portal, because in the portal it shows you in the list before you click details. It will show you the client app, and it'll say conditional access success, even if conditional access was not applied, as you can see in that graphic there. This is really important because if your sysadmin's just looking really quickly, they're going to think that conditional access is working when it is actually not even being applied. So very important point right here. So the first thing you can do to fix this is tweak conditional access policy, just include everything. Again, it's much easier now that this has been reworked by Microsoft to actually do an implicit deny on the applications that don't meet the protocol for what this is. And the end behavior is the client can authenticate Activesync, and it looks like they can load an account, but they can't view anything, and we'll get a message saying, hey, you don't have access to anything, which is actually pretty cool too, and newer. And then you can also just disable legacy authentication altogether. Please do it. Please kill legacy auth. It is bad. That's kind of a universal truth. But realistically, we know that many clients are still using it. You're always going to have that person who just has to use Thunderbird or Pine or whatever, and they're probably a VIP. So just make sure to do due diligence. If you're enrolling users in two-factor via Duo, you're going to want to make sure that your conditional access policy covers everything. Basic auth is disabled for new tenants, 365 tenants, and existing tenants that have zero use of basic auth. So if you've got one user, your tenant has not disabled basic authentication. Plenty more resources on this. Happy to answer questions. And that's it. That's all I got.